Um, okay, we'll get started. And so today we're going to continue, push on with a bit more, cover more other topics in Vue. And actually, there are two parts. And the first part, we're going to talk about class and styling. So this is about basically how do you give, say, the Vue component different CSS classes. So we change the formatting, or sometimes you actually apply CSS directly and using Vue. And the other part is about components, which is actually much longer and more relevant to the coursework. So we're going to start with the class and style binding. So in a sense, you can bind a class to a HTML element, or you can even bind CSS formatting rules directly. Okay, and so this is quite common. For example, and if you want to your website or apps to be interactive, you need to change the display and of your elements from time to time. Sometimes could be as simple, for example, when the user before the user is logged in, you need to show the username password field, and once user is logged in, the fields need to be removed from page. One of this can be done is just through CSS. You can say display hidden, then it's just disappear from the page. So, and we already seen this before at Viewbind. Anyone remembers? So Viewbind basically allows you to change the properties over the HTML element. So it could be any properties, so that including the class definition, or actually just directly the style property of element. Then it will change the change the formatting of the element. But and what is more interesting here is we want to control this dynamically, say based on your using some code. That's where things get a bit more interesting. So let's see a simple example. And so first, we can decide when a class is applied or not. So for example, if we look at this code, and you can say vbind class, which is this part here. So all that does is say, okay, I'm going to bind whatever following the class to this div element. Okay, but the thing here is a little bit different. It says the class name is actually called active, but it will not be applied all the time. It depends on the value of this isActive variable, which has to be a Boolean variable or be evaluated as Boolean variable. So if this isActive is true, then the this div would have active class applied. But if this is false, basically, then it will not have this class. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, okay. Okay, let's try to do a very simple example. Let me see, do I have any? Okay. Okay, this is a simple example where you have two. Okay, so this is already slightly more complex. Let's just do this simple one. Let's just do this simple one. So, and I have this. I have a div which has this, and I need an ID equal to customer. So I see. Blah. I have to put this in a script. Format to decode a bit better. Okay. Data. I can't use this. Data, what is it called? Is oh, okay. So this is what I did so far. I copied this line of code from the lecture slides, and it has a div element, it has an ID, but the more interesting part is this Viewbind part. So I want to bind the class to this element, and the class name is called active. We haven't defined, so that needs to be defined in your CSS file, say what the active class will do. But the input and the interesting things is here, whether this is applied or not depends on the value of is active. So maybe make this look slightly easier to. Why is that? Okay, and I can open this page in my live view, which currently probably do nothing. Okay. Okay, at least you can see on this side now. And so I have a simple line text for this dev. And then its text is just CSS class demo, which is this part here, which shows in this code here. And if we look at the develop tools, okay, that's slightly more complicated. Ah. Okay, sorry. I forgot to including the defined view. So I think load the view source file. I forgot to do that. Let me see if I can remember. Okay. And if we do this div again, can you see at all on the? Oops, where did it go? Okay. It'll be difficult to fit in. Okay, and so if we just look at this part, and you can see currently, and this div, it has. It just shows it directly. It does not evaluate. Of course. And can anyone knows why the view is not running? So actually, if you look at this one, and it still shows the view code in the HTML, it's not evaluating to. That's right, because I forgot to write the link the view with the element here, so I need to. My hashtag. Oops. There's some errors. Yeah. Okay, let's see it again. Finally. So you can see currently this div has a class equal to active. And that's because the value of is active is true. You can see in the code and here is active is true. That's why it's applied. And I can change that dynamically if I can get the console to show here. Okay. Can you see that at all at the bottom of the? Might be a bit harder for the. Okay, let's do it on the console page. So what I typed in here is I typed in class demo.isActive. So class demo is the name for this new Vue instance, and it says that currently the isActive value is true. That's what it is here. So you can change it here, say equal to false, and then we go back here, and if you look at our div again, where did it go? Okay, so you can see that one here now currently has no class at all. It only has class, and that one is disabled. So this is a way you can use your Vue instance to change what class will be applied to a element, and then as a result, change its appearance. Yeah, does that make sense? Let's go back to the slides now. Okay, and the other thing you need to know is, say, this one does not interfere with other class assigned, say, in the normal way. So, for example, when you write your HTML code, you probably will assign some HTML class, class to some elements, and this does not all interfere with that. And so, if we look at this example, we have a div, and with the first line says class equal to static. So that's a normal HTML way of assigning class to HTML. And then we have this part. So it says Viewbind class. That's what we just introduced. So it's possible to apply two more classes. One is called active, and the other one is actually called TextEngine. So the TextEngine has been quote because it has dash in the middle. And when these two classes will be applied depends on the value of these and the two view variable after them. So is active or has error. So we're already seeing that with is active. If its value changes, we'll decide whether active is applied, and then whether has error is true or false, we'll decide whether text apply or TextEngine class will be applied. So let's say this is the values in the Vue instance. So let's say in the data we have is active equals true and has error equal to false. So that means this will apply and this will not apply. But as a result, you have this div, which class is static. It comes this part, and then active comes from this part. So we can have more than, so first, if you have normal way, the class defined in normal way will still remain. It will not be affected. And you can have more than one class to decide by the view. And then the way that works is just like this. Yeah. And for example, in this case, if the value of has error is changed to true, then it will have three classes: static, active, and TextEngine. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Do you think it's useful to see that in working the code, or well, that's okay? Yeah.
How would you apply this, like, as an example?
Okay. How can that be used? Yeah, we're gonna come to that a little bit later. Yeah. Okay. And maybe just very quickly, and for example, so for example here, I gave the div a class using the normal way called the div class, and then you can see in this page here, if I can find the div class, and so you can see this one now have two classes, and div class, which is what I defined here in the div element, and then the active, which is added by the Viewbind. And I can do the same. I can in the console, I can make is active false, and then if I come back here, and it will remove the active class. Okay, and so sometimes it might be a little bit, and say, make the code a little bit difficult to read. And if you have something like this, and in your HTML code, getting a little bit too long, so instead, you could just say Viewbind class equal to class object, which is variable. Is again just a view variable, but its value is say including these. So these are which are essentially these. Okay, so it's the same. So what it happens is now instead of having these in the HTML, it got moved into the Vue code, and sometimes this will be easier to read compared to into the code readability will be a bit better, and the effect is exactly the same. Yeah. Okay, so now it comes to example where this can be useful, and here we also starting to use the computed property. So essentially that just means this computed part of your view. So in the computed property we have this function, and we'll return an object. The object will have these two values, active and text danger, but its value will depend on the other variables in the Vue instance. Okay, for example, the active will be true only if this dot is active. So maybe you have another variable which is called isActive, which states if your Vue instance is active, and also and not this dot error. That means when there's no error, and the active will be true. Okay, and so similarly for text danger, for it to be true, it has so first has to this dot error, and this dot error type equal to fatal. This way you can decide when to apply the class, which will change the appearance. So obviously you don't want to apply the text danger class when everything is working fine. You only do that when say there's error in your code. More specifically, the error type will be fatal. Okay, so that's one way to use them. Is that okay, or do you want to see it? Okay, so Vue actually provides more than just this. So you can say put all the class conditions in the HTML element, or you can create an object, or even put the object inside a computed property. And there's another way is say you can put all the class in an array. So what does it here is try to bind class instead of say doing as a JSON object, which is before, if you remember this one. And essentially this is a JSON object, has two properties. So in this case it becomes an array. So it applies to actually these are the two variables you defined in your Vue code, and they would have value active for the active class and text danger for the error class. So when you actually run the code, it will give active and text danger to the div element. Okay, so this is slightly convoluted way to assign class to an element, and the benefit would be you can change the value of active class or error class in your Vue code, and then different class will be applied. So that's not something you can do previously without Vue. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you could change, say, the error class to, say, I don't know, fatal error, and then the class applied will be active and fatal error. Okay, and to make things even more complicated, you can do something like this. Does anyone remember what does this part does? What does this part do? So this is not part of the view, so that's just plain JavaScript. But what does this do? Sorry? That's right. So this is the way to say if and then. So that means, what it means is, oops. Uh, Okay, what this part says, it says, if the value of isActive is true, use active class. And if isActive's value is false, empty, that means don't have anything. That's all. And it will have another class, which will be the value of this error class, which is the thing before. Okay. So basically, error class will be always applied, but whether isActive will apply depends on the value of whether active class will be applied depends on the value of isActive variable. Okay, and then this is the equivalent of this. So active column isActive is the examples we saw at the very beginning. If we go back, so if you remember this example, in this example, say we just say, okay, whether active is applied or not depends on the value of isActive. So that's exactly what we are doing here, but now use it as part of the array, so you can imagine have other elements in the array as well to apply more classes. Okay, so now I'm going to mention about a component, which is going to be covered right after this. But just treatment component is something you like just as normal Vue instances, but this is some Vue instance you defined yourself. Okay, so for example, this is my Vue component, and it has a name called my component, and this is the template. Template essentially is what the component defines what the component is going to look like. And in your HTML code, you use component like this, just like a div or h1 or a paragraph. You say my component, open bracket, and then close tag there. And you can set a class there. Okay, so what you can see here is first in the Vue component definition, you have defined two classes for this template, which is the full and bar. And then when you're using the component in your HTML code, you define two more classes for it. It's the baz and bool. So that's why the actual HTML code, after it's processed by the Vue, would have these all four classes. Okay. So basically, the class in the template got added onto the class that introduced in the HTML. Just as we discussed before, for example, if you define any class in HTML, which will be add on top or in addition to whatever the Vue does to the element. Okay, so you can also use Viewbind class the same as you do with, say, a div we've seen before. You can do it this way as well. So make it a conditional. And when it's true that active class will be included into the definition. Okay, and so far we look at examples which give different classes to an element, but it's possible actually to apply CSS directly as well. So here, so instead of using Viewbind class, which we do before, we say Viewbind style. So essentially the style is the HTML element attributes that you can apply, say, specific formatting to individual element. Okay, so if we look at this example here, it says, let me see if I can make the mouse cursor bigger. No. Touch trackpad. No. Okay, can't change the mouse size. Okay, anyway, let's come back. So instead of a Viewbind class, now it becomes Viewbind's style. And then you follow the actual CSS code. It would put, say, in the CSS file. So it says color equal to active color, font size equal to font size plus px, which is number of pixels. The only difference here is now the active color and font size are view variables. That means that value can change dynamically. So for example, in the view instance, in the data section, so the active color is red, then this text will be shown in red, and the font size is 30, and this part will be 30 pixels. The good thing is then you can change the value of active color and font size in JavaScript, and then the display will change on your page. Yeah, that's something can be useful. Okay, and just similar as before, when we applying multiple class to an HTML element, we can, instead of, say, list all the class in the HTML element, we can create an object and then list those there. Do you remember that part? Okay, just this one here. So when we bind the class, instead of list all the class here, we use a class object, and then actual class was listed in class object. So we can do that for CSS as well. So instead of putting all the formatting rules in the HTML element, we can put all the formatting rules inside the data part of the Vue instance. So that's what this part do. So the style says equal to style object, and then in the data part of the Vue, you said style object is a JSON object. It has the color, value is red, and font size is 13 pixels. So achieve exactly the same effects as before here, but say put all the formattings inside the Vue instance, and make this part a little bit easier to read the HTML part. Yeah, and finally, you can also use array to bind the styles. And so in this case, we bind. So first, you have the difference here is now use square bracket. That means this is an array, has two elements, and base style will be an object similar to this, that will including all the formatting rules. And then you can add another one. It says overriding styles. So these are some specific styles, probably for this element, to apply, and the base styles will be applied to everything. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about in terms of applying or binding class and styles. And so if the reading is there, so that's the link, and if you click, it will go to the guide of the Vue guide, which talks about class and bindings. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next part. It's probably a bit more complex and probably a bit more interesting as well, which is the components. So we mentioned that components actually in the first lecture already, and also we in the Vue part, also in the CSS and the class binding part, we also talk about components briefly. And so this is the example we had before. So this is how you define a new component, something that can be used at other places in your code. So you say view.component. That's a way to declare this is a new component. Now it says button dash counter. So you need to give a name of your view component. And obviously you can't use the name which is already an HTML element. For example, you cannot call this component a button because the button is already an HTML element. So you can't use that. Okay, then you have a data function, the data section or data property, which is exactly the same as a view instance, except here you have a function. We're going to come back to that. So that's one of the difference between a component and a view instance. And then you have the template. So template basically defines what the component is going to look like. So inside it, it's just really just HTML code, that's all. So you say, I have a button, and when the button is clicked, so v unclicked, that means when the button is clicked, it says counter plus plus. So the counter is a variable defined in the view instance. So that will increase the value of that by 1. And then the actual button itself, it will say you clicked me counter times. So obviously the counter will change. The more you click, the more number is going to show here. And once this is defined, you can use that in your view code. In the sense, you can use button counter just as any HTML element, like a button or P1 or H1. And it will have the button, and you can click, it will display. So that's how you do it. So if we create a div which use button counter, which is the same name we defined in the component declaration, and then just have to create the view to do that. Okay, let's do that in the code. Let's continue this part. So let's do this. Okay, so we define a div, and it's called components demo, and inside it do a button counter. So obviously, so far, button counter hadn't been defined, so it will not do anything. And this is not linked to any view, so it will not do anything either because of that. So we need to first declare or define this component. So you need to do okay. So, oops. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna fix that in a second. And so this is the code, just a copy paste from here, and it defines a new view component. Its name is called the button counter. That's what we use here when we call it. It has data parts, essentially has one variable called count, and this is the actual template. So essentially it's a button, and when you click it, it will change the value of count, which is here by 1, and then display this line text. Obviously, it is currently not happy and complaining. Okay, can anyone see why that's complaining? Okay, so it's because of quotation marks. So what should I use? Or should I remove quotation marks or replace it with something else? Any guess? So, yeah. So for example, I can remove it. Okay. Stop complaining, but actually it will not work. It start complaining here as this little one. Okay. So what you actually need to use is not the single quote or double quote, is the other letter, very similar. I don't know what's the word for this, but can you see that button there. This looks very close to a single quote, but it's slightly tilted. I don't know what, but that's the word and the mark you have to for your template. That's very important. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. Yeah. Okay, so now you can see it's happy now. It's not complaining anymore. So if we go to the actual page, it's not refreshing anymore. Of course. And then just need to create the Vue instance, which actually link to the that links to the HTML element, the div element. So I still probably give it a name called okay, can't use dash. Yeah. Oh. Okay, so this is probably the simplest possible Vue instance. So all it does is just say link and to this div component here. And now if I go to the HTML page, okay, so you can see now I have this button now. So because now this div is now linked to the view, so it's gonna work. It's gonna load this button counter, which is what we define here as a new component. And inside the component, it really just shows a button. The text inside the button is you click me how many times. And currently the button value is 0, so that's to say you click me 0 times. And if you click once, twice, and you can do multiple times. Yeah, so that's how component works. So essentially, you almost like define a new HTML element, and you name it however way you want, and you decide how it's going to look or behave, and then you can use it in your code. So obviously, you define component is because you want to use it multiple times. If it's something you're going to only use once, you might not want to define it as a component. So if we go back to the slides, okay. For example, here, if I wanted 3 buttons, I can just do it 3 times, like this, and I can easily do that in my code. So let me see, or maybe even more. Just for the sake of the demonstration, I'll just do it 3 times. Okay, so now you can see I now have 3 buttons. Now I have 3 buttons on my page. Okay, the next part is a bit more interesting. Okay, so if I click one of the buttons, do you think it will change the numbers on the one button or change all of them? So if you click on the first button, it will show me you clicked me 1 times. But will those 2 change as well?
No.
Yes? No? Okay. Or the question will be, say, what should be the correct behavior? So, so the correct behavior should be the other buttons should not be affected if you click this button. Because, for example, you want to do something for this part, say you have a submit button for your forms, and you don't want to click that button, submit, and submit all other forms which reuse the same, which also submit. You want the other submit and only works when people click it, submit that part of information. So that's exactly what happens here. So if I click this one multiple times, these 2 don't change, and they only change when I click them. So basically, each of the components is independent. They maintain their own copy of the your definition, and it only changes by itself, so they're not affected. Okay, so this is achieved by defining the data as a function in the template. So, okay, if you look at our code here, in our component definition, you can see the data itself is a function and it returns this. Okay, so that kind of extra step or wrapping is needed to make sure these are not linked to each other. Okay, so in other words, if I don't define the data as a function, then if I click one, the other will change as well. Maybe that will be the desired behavior sometimes, but that should not be the correct behavior for the code. For a component, oops. It doesn't not even work. Okay, and so now I changed the code of the data section. Now this is more like our normal Vue instance data section. It has a count, has a value of 0, and if I click here, it doesn't even work. Okay. And so you can see the error message, it says data option should be a function. So it does not even allow me to do that in Vue now. So can't do that. So can't demonstrate to you what's going to happen. Okay, so the way of using the component is almost like, in a sense, similar to the DOM tree of your page. But in a sense, you have a hierarchy. So for example, let's say this is the design of your web page. You want to build it. You can have the root component, which are always there, which is like the root for the DOM. And you say, okay, this is my header component. This is my main page component. And this is my sidebar component. Okay, then for my, say, the main page component or main content component, I have two more things, two more components inside it. That's these two. And on my sidebar, I have three more boxes here, and these three too. Okay, so for example, these two can be the same. You can define this component as one and reuse twice. Similar, this is a different component reused 3 times. But you can organize your entire user interface to something like this. Okay, and so this is how we define the component so far. So we just have to say Vue in terms of capital Vue, in terms of that's a class, dot component, and then bracket, then that's your component name, and followed by whatever the component you do, including templates. Okay, and this is a so-called global registration. In the sense, the component defined this way can be used anywhere else in the Vue code. Okay, the next part is once you define a component, for example, the one we did before, which is click a button, that's useful. But in many cases, you want the component to be able to change its appearance using your code. And for the button, you might want to, say, change the text displayed on the button. You may not want the button to all display the same text. So to do that, we need something called props, which is short for property. So in a sense, the props is almost like a parameters for a function. And for example, what would be the good function? Okay, so if we have a function which sort an array, then you need the input, which is array, then it can sort it, right? And without any input, the sorting function itself is not very particularly useful. It's the same here. So if you want to pass any values to a template, you need to use the so-called props, which essentially works like an array, like a parameter for a function. Okay, and so in this case, we are creating a new component called a blog post. So this is like if you know blog, you can make a new post every time. The goal is to make each post as a component. And so here we need one input parameter or one props, which is called title. So that this way each blocks can have a specific title, which makes sense. It does not make too much sense if all the blocks have exactly the same title. And once you define these props and the way to define the template, then you can use it in your template. You can say h3 double curly bracket title. So just as you would use a Vue variable, and then these values will be replaced when it's run. Okay, and for example, when you actually need to use it, this is how you do it. You say blog post title, which is the name of this props you define here, equal to certain value. And it will replace that part when rendering this component. Okay, let's have a look. Let's do this one first. So in our page now we have 3. Control Shift F. Okay, currently I'm going to define 3 blog posts, and it will not display anything because browser doesn't understand what blog post element is, but it does not report error either. It just says it's something it doesn't quite understand. And then we're going to tell it what those blog posts is by using Vue. So first we need to introduce the definition so it knows. Okay, now we have the definition of the component called a blog post. It has a props called title, and all it does is just display a title, which is not super exciting. And then we need to define the actual Vue instance. What's that called? Okay. So now I come up with the first issue. So obviously when I try to apply the Vue code, I have to link to an element. But in this case, we don't have element to link in. Instead, we have 3 blog post element. Okay. Obviously, that is not something I can link to because that is not quite defined yet. Yeah. So what we can do is actually we have to put this inside something else. In many cases, just a div. And then we can link to this element. No. Oh, of course. Hashtag. Okay, so that's all happening now. So now to understand what a blog post is, So every time it used this property that's provided by this line to replace here. So put the title going to be replaced by my journal with Vue, blog with Vue, why Vue is so fun, etc. Okay, so this shows you how to use pass value to a component. Okay, and then say in most cases, actually for your coursework as well, what really going to happen is you're going to have a array which actually stores all these information about the component you need to display. So for example, you have the information of all the courses. In this case, it stores in the posts array, which is the part of the data. And then you can use Vue4 or V4 to iterate through this posts array, and then it will create these three posts, which was only with only the headings. Does that make sense? So the things is okay. So first you have to do V4, and it says I'm gonna go through the posts, which is the posts defined here, and then Viewbind key. We're gonna come back to this a little bit later, but this part, the Viewbind title, essentially says I want the title property to be post.title, so that will be the post.title. Okay. Okay, let's try this ourselves. So we can modify just the code we had so far. Yeah, so we need an array. I'm gonna just copy and paste, save a little bit of time. So now I have something called the posts, which is an array which has these things. So now instead of doing this, I can comment these out. I'm going to do my V4 part here. So this way only need one blog post item, but inside this blog post, what you need to do is say first use V4, and that is, let's call it post in posts. No, just, and then I think it's called oops, come back here, Viewbind title equal to post, okay, and then we have to do the Viewbind key. Okay, I'm going to come back to this. There's something required that you have to do. Okay, so obviously it displays exactly the same as before, but now we can see these are already removed. So actually these are created by this part. Okay. Okay, wow. We are very much behind. And okay. Yeah, we might not be able to do much demo afterwards now, just because we're running behind the schedule. We have about only less than half an hour left. Okay, and so the next part is, okay, this part is saying, and you will need a div to include everything. So that's what we did here. We have to use this div here to including everything. We're going to using later on to use the components. And then later on, so for the actual blog post, you might need more than just the title. So you might want to say the content and the time that was published, or maybe even the comments. And then the code can get a bit long in HTML, something like this. So instead, what you can do is say, besides just the key, which is required, you just say, and bind the post to the post, which is, okay. And so there are two posts here. The first is the post property, which will be defined in your Vue component definition as the props. That's the prop here. That's the post here, which is this post. And the second post here will be defined here, which is the iteration using v4. That's each element inside the posts array. Okay, so that basically it binds. So basically passed each element in the array to the props in the component. And then once it's passed, and you can get different property of the post, like a title, like a comment, or publish date, out of the post property. So essentially what it does is say, instead of having all these different bindings as each as individual prop, so combine them into one object, which is called a post, and then get all the information from one object afterwards. Yes? That makes the code easier to read and slightly cleaner. Okay, so besides being able to passing data from the parents or from whoever calling using the component, it's also possible to pass data the other way. So get something out from the component. Essentially, most of the cases will be passing from a component to its parent. So in this example, we try to change the font size if the user clicked a button in a component. Okay, the font changing is not happening in the component itself, but at this parent level. But let's just have a look at the parents first. That's the Vue instance, and it has this posts, which including all the posts which I saw before, and it currently has a variable called post font size, which is equal to 1. So that will be changed to increase or reduce the font size. And then can be used to control the style blog post. Okay, so this is still using the blog post and component we defined before, and it will go through the posts array and use the ID as the key and get everything from the post. So that's exactly the same as before, nothing changed. But inside the component definition, we made some changes. So now we introduce this part, which is called a button. So now previously only had a title and maybe some other things we didn't really do, but now we have a button. The button has a text called enlarge text. So now it will look at something like this. So basically, if you run this, the component will show a title, and with a button below it, it says enlarge text. But if you click button, nothing can happen yet because we haven't defined any handler for the click action. Okay, so for inside the component now, which is what we defined here, we say v on enlarge text equal to post font size plus, font size plus equal to 0.1. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. So first, enlarge text is something new, which is called a custom event, which is something you have to define yourself. And this part would be the action. So in this case, if you remember, post font size is a variable defined in the Vue instance. So just increase the value by 0.1. So what it's saying here is, so I'm gonna do this event handler when this enlarged text event happens, I will do this action. Okay, so how do you trigger this event? Is relatively simple. So this is the button that's inside each post. It says v on click. So previously we don't have this yet. We just have button enlarge text and close it button tag. Now we say v on click equal to $ emit. So that's a special view and method. It will create a new event called enlarge text. So basically that will trigger this part. Does that make sense? That's the view. Okay, really just because we're running out of time, otherwise I could show you that in the important things is to remember, say, this is inside the HTML code. This is when you actually, after define the blog post element and use it as just as a normal HTML element. So that will be inside the HTML code. And this is part that goes inside the definition of the component. So basically, this goes inside when you try to define the blog post component. Okay, that's the thing to remember. Okay, and so besides you can say do something, essentially reacted to the events happened inside the component, you can even return some values as well. So not just say, okay, something happened, but also can come with value. So the only difference is say in the emit function. So previously in the emit function, we only just say gonna trigger this event in large text. Now I follow something called by 0.1, so that values will be received. And to say the same, we will try to change the font size in the actual blog post element. And you can say v on enlarge text when this event happens, post font size plus equal to event. So that will give you the value 0.1. Then you can change how much you want. So it can be 0.2 or 5, etc. So basically this $ event will refer to the values passed by this enlarged text event. Does that make sense? So basically what it says, besides you can say something happened, you can also pass a value. That's all. So the event in large text just says, okay, that's a special type of event happened, and now you can have a value. Okay, and then so here the event handler is essentially just a line of JavaScript code in the in the HTML itself, but sometimes it might be more complicated, several lines, and in those cases you might define a function instead of putting the JavaScript code just in HTML directly. For example, you have 5 lines of code you need to do when that button is clicked. So you create one thing and define this as a method. So that method will be run. The only thing that you need to remember is this 0.1, which was can be accessed using the $event sign, will be automatically treated as the first parameters in your function. So if you when this is clicked, I'm gonna run this function, which needs to be defined in your Vue instance, and if this function has any parameters, it will automatically get the values returned, which in this case 0.1. Yeah. So I mean, there's nothing to stop you, say, from returning an object which contains multiple attributes, so then you can return multiple values that way. Okay, before we go on next, we'll quickly just review the view model. Anyone remembers what view model does? Yeah, exactly. So the view models allows you to bind something on your page to, say, a variable in your view instance. And it's two-way binding in the sense, if the value changes on the page, then the view variable value will change. The other way also works. If you change the view variable value in your code, then the page will also change. Okay, so that's the examples we had at the first Vue lecture. Say we have a view model. It binds this input field to the message variable in your data. Then it will start with hello view. So that's why this line paragraph will display. And if you change the view model in text input, and this part will display. But if you change the message in the code, that would also change. Okay. So really, view model is just one way to make you write slightly less code, because you can achieve the same effect of view model using binding both ways. So that's what this here. So instead of saying input v model search text, you can say v input v bind value equal to search text. So this will bind the value property of the input field to the search text variable in your view instance. So this is binding from HTML to Vue. Okay, and then to do the other binding is from Vue to HTML. You can say Vue on input. That means when user typed in something, you change the search text value to the $event.target.value. So that means the $event will be the input event, the target will be the text field, and the value will be what user entered in text field. So that one says that's from the HTML to Vue binding. So everything, when user typed in something, it will update the search text variable in Vue. So what I'm trying to say is this is the equivalent of doing view model. Okay, so if you want to do the view model on a component, okay, so previously we're using view model on the instance, essentially that's a root level view, and it's similar. So from the Vue to HTML is the same. So you say it will bind the value of the input field to search text variable. The other way is actually slightly simpler. You say when user typing something, the search text will equal to event. So slightly shorter than this, but very similar. Okay, and to actually get it to work is slightly more complicated. So you first have to bind the value attributes to the value prop of the component. Okay, so your components need to have a prop. It doesn't have to be called value, but some props which will be binded to the value of the input field. And then when the input events happened, it has to emit its own events to trigger this update. So what happens is, say, you define this component, you have this value, and it will be binding to the value of the input field. Okay, and this is slightly more complicated. Okay, let's explain this way. So the first value here, anyone knows what that comes from? So for this line, v bind value equal to value. Where does the first value come from? So you have two options. Is this value comes from the HTML element, the input element, or is it comes from the props of the component? Which one is that? The first value. Okay, so someone say HTML, some say props. So this one is actually the HTML. So essentially, this just, if you treat it as HTML code, you will say view Viewbind view. So that means I want to bind this property of my element to something. That comes from HTML. And the second value, I wish they use a different one, but this comes from here. So that basically means the input, it has binding the value property of that input field to the value and variable in the view instance. Okay, they use exactly the same name, make it a bit more confusing, but that's what it means. Okay, and then you have to deliberately do your own, say, the emit events as well. It says view on input. You have to emit an input event with the value. So the format is the same. So as before, you emit a type of the event and then the value for the event. So the type will be input, and then for example, it will be click, that will be click. Other type will be other type, and then this will be the value. Okay, once you define this, then you can use view model or v model to bind the two. Okay, so basically, if it's a root instance of Vue, you don't have to do these definitions. But if you define your own component, if you want to use v model, it will be more complex. I mean, not that much more complex, but you have to define a few extra things before you can use it. Okay, so at least this is a slightly easier one. So we've seen before, which you can say pass values to the component using prop, but the way to pass it is using the attributes in the element name. For example, if you remember the blog post, and you say the title property of the blog post equal to something, and then that get to pass to the component, right? And here, instead of doing that, you can actually do something like this. So you want to say alert box, something bad happened, closing alert box. And that's more natural way. For example, if this is a button, you will say button, something bad happened, close the button tag, and you have the button with that as a text. Or this will be the H1 or P. That's the more natural way to show. It's actually possible, and that's called slot. So if you define a slot, and it will use whatever in between the closing and the starting tag to replacing this. Okay, maybe let's give this a try, because I think this example is not that clear. Okay, and same. It doesn't format it properly. Oh. Okay, so how to do this again? ID equal what? Yeah, maybe not quite anything now. Where's my hashtag? Okay, so I defined this alert box component, okay, and the only thing different is I have this slot here. That's the only difference. What it does, this will be replaced with anything you typed in between the alert box. That's why here it says error, something bad happened. So you can just do, say, alert box, something good happened. Huh. Misspelling. Okay, so you can see the second time I use something good happened, and that is replaced the text here, and then I can also do alert box with, okay, it will again replace with whatever text is there. So that's just slot, so it's slightly easier. But then this way you can only have one thing, and it has to be text, just be replaced directly. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. We can just have to go as much as we can, and maybe there are a few pages we can have time to. Actually, yeah, I might skip this. In terms of dynamic components, just have a look over the lecture slides after the. Okay, I just want to talk very briefly. For example, how you might want to use components in coursework 1. Okay, there's no, I don't think there's any mark directly says you have to use component, but to use it usually gonna make your life a little bit easier. So let's say this is the design, which is what I created maybe 2 weeks ago as one way. So that's the simple page with the search box, a few buttons, filters on the left, and then on the right hand side will be actually return the search results. And it says product probably should be more like a class or activities. Okay. And this is how we did before. So we just use all the standard and HTML elements. Nothing, no, say, customized component come from the Vue at all. So if you can read it very quickly, say we have this container which covers everything, and probably should be called main anyway. And in the header section, we had a picture, a div, so an image, which is a logo. The div give you the search box or the looking of the search box, and a few buttons for login registration and shopping cart. In the side, which are a sidebar, we have some divs. This is defined as a filter class, which gives it the look. And in the main side, you have a few things called product. Okay, so what you can potentially do, and you can make each of these into a component of itself. Okay, so you can have a component called class container, and inside it has 3 other components called header, assign, and main. That's all. So can you imagine what the code-wise it might look like? So it may be something look like this. And you may have header. Okay, you can't call it main because that's but I'll just do it now anyway, because okay. So obviously, you need to define what container header and main as a component in in your Vue first, and then if we go back to the and inside the header, you can have further components, which are the logo, the search, the login registration, and shopping cart buttons. Okay. Or you can make it slightly simpler, not a hierarchy strictly like this, but also like this. So you have the header, which including all these things, but just as one component, not each of us as individual ones. And for the aside, it's automatically including all the filters and the main. And inside you have another component called product. Okay, these are still useful because if you look at this, you have filter appeared multiple times, and sometimes you might need to generate this dynamically. So it might be useful to create this as a component so you can reuse them. And similarly for the product itself, it's going to appear a few times as well. So you might want to define that as a component. Okay, and then in the lab next week, the task will be try to create the component hierarchies for the coursework website. Okay, and before we finish, so once you completely defined this hierarchy, for example, this will be defined in your Vue instance or the Vue component, then you only need to add your root. Only add your root component to HTML page, and that's all. Because everything else will be defined. Does that make sense? Okay, so this will be inside your Vue. I don't even think that's a possible thing to do. And you define your component, define your container of this, and then, for example, and later you have another Vue component defines what's inside the header. This defines the name, which is the header, which including a few things, which I'm not going to type in here. And then in the end, you only need to add the container to your HTML page, because that will including the header inside it. Header would including whatever components inside it. Yeah, that will make the HTML page very clean and quite short. Okay, we'll stop there. We're slightly over time. Yeah.